Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast. This time, you've got me, Kieran Richardson, one of the head coaches at Omnia Performance. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you're going to completely ignore the fact that I need a haircut. And instead, you're going to focus on the fact that today we are going to be talking about mental toughness. We're going to define what it is, talk about the different types, and far more importantly, we're going to talk about some of the practical tools that you can employ in training for how you can develop this very important trait, particularly if you feel it's something that you've never really had before and you don't really understand it. So hopefully a number of very useful takeaways and some practical tools that you can employ in your next race or training session, and a lot of value, hopefully. Now, one of the things that I find when it comes to mental toughness is that it is very poorly misunderstood. It's hard to define. People talk about it in different ways, and this is true when you look at the research on it too. People have different ideas about it, what it means. So for the sake of this podcast, I'm simply going to refer to it or mean it in a way that we're going to talk about the ability to keep going when something hurts, or when you are feeling that your body is telling you to stop. And that's where we're going to stop with the definition. We'll keep it really nice and simple. And what I find is that many beginners, particularly if you listen to this and you're new to the endurance side of training specifically, not necessarily on the gym side, but specifically the endurance, then many people have a very flawed idea of mental toughness, particularly if perhaps they've bitten off more than they can chew at any one time, and then they've been either forced to quit or confront the reality that perhaps they weren't where they thought they were. And often that can knock people back. So one of the things that I find straight away is that beginner athletes misinterpret intensity and how hard they're working. And I see this objectively quite clearly in people's data. So very often what happens when somebody first gets into running, and I'm going to use running as an example, obviously it's booming at the moment, and very often what we see is that the intensities that we know as more experienced athletes are sustainable for a long time. So once you stop being able to talk in full sentences and you get into the more zone-free, sort of moderate intensity exercise, we know that we can sustain that for a long time. But if you have never been out of breath on a run and all of a sudden you find yourself unable to talk in full sentences, very often you see beginners get a bit panicky, or they think they're working far harder than they are. And because they have no frame of reference, they have nothing to compare it to. They don't know that this is actually a very sustainable intensity to work out. And I saw this in two places quite regularly. The first was when I was working in phase 1 training in the army, and people who hadn't done these hard things before, they didn't realize how much more they had to give because they'd never done it before. And it's not their fault. They've had no exposure to these hard things. And the second place that I see it quite objectively is in beginner athletes' lactate threshold heart rate testing. So when I have new athletes come to me, very often we start with some basic physiological testing so that we can set their training zones and that we can then prescribe accurate training. Now, what I see very regularly is that people who are new to the endurance side, they'll do their lactate threshold heart rate test, which is, for those that haven't done one, if you've not had the joy of following an Omnia program before, it is a 30-minute max effort run. It's a very simple test, and we simply take the data from the back 20 minutes of that test and we use it to set some zones. Very often what I see is that people who don't have enough experience here, they almost have given themselves an artificial ceiling because they're not pushing to what is a true maximum effort. They don't know how to pace it. Perhaps they don't realize how hard they can push. And I'll put some arbitrary numbers on this, but let's say for a young person, that might give them, say, a lactate threshold of 160. Whereas we know in reality, the vast majority of people, say my age, is probably going to be a bit higher than that. And it's simply a case that they didn't know how hard to push and they have capped themselves. And what I see often sort of 6 months or a year down the line, when they've built up a big catalogue of hard training, they've done a lot of hard efforts, we've really built them up, is that rather than things going down as they age, and I've worked with a number of athletes now for multiple year periods, so you would expect a very slight decline in things like max heart rate as you age. Often what we see is that actually their maximum or their threshold heart rates have increased quite significantly. And it's not because their true threshold has actually increased, it's because they've managed to push much harder in training. And that's what we're going to talk about. So many of you will feel that perhaps you are capped. And we're going to talk about how this mental toughness is a skill. It is a trainable skill. It is not a personality trait. It is not something that you either born with, or if you haven't perhaps had a history of sport or training, that tough luck, you no longer have this. You're destined to never become a David Goggins, for example. It is a very, very trainable skill. Now, one of the other aspects that I think is helpful to address for a bit of expectation management is this idea that many people think things will get easier as they get fitter. And that might be true at the low end. So let's say, for example, that you want to go on a coffee shop ride with your friends, or go for a run, park run, and then meet your friends for coffee afterwards, for example. If you are very new in your journey, you may not be able to complete those things without significant effort. And obviously, as you get fitter, sure, that will decrease your sense of effort, and you'll be able to accomplish those things easier. Where people get confused is that they think, so I want you to imagine your first 5K, your first ever hard 5K. Many people think that it will get easier, that feeling of the burning or the pain that you go through in a hard 5K. As you get fitter, in reality, what actually happens is you are capable of digging much deeper and deeper and deeper. If I think back to the first time I ever ran a hard 5K, I was nowhere near my true physiological ceiling. Whereas now I can absolutely bury myself. I can squeeze every last drop out, and I'm sure there's still work to be done. When I say every last drop, I'm sure in reality I'm probably not quite there. But regardless, I'm capable of working and sitting at a much higher heart rate and really, really digging myself into a hole. And that is something that many people don't understand. They expect it to get easier in the hard efforts, when in reality, you're actually capable of digging much deeper and pushing much, much harder. And that will come over time. Now, when I talk about mental toughness as a skill, I know this for a fact because I've experienced what it is like to be thrust into a hard situation without having this background of training to draw on. And I can remember very, very acutely, and it's like it was yesterday, the first time that I was ever forced to quit. And it happened for me when I was 16. I had just joined a military college, Welbeck. It's now closed, and it was essentially a feeder college for some of the military pipelines in the British military. So you could go to this college and then join either the Army, Navy, RAF as an officer, and that was the training pipeline. And as you can imagine, the training was pretty tough for a 16, 17-year-old. There was plenty of opportunity to get really stuck into things like cross country. And that was where I had my first experience of this. So we had a competitive cross country team, and the training was taken quite seriously. And it was the first time that I had ever been exposed to true structured interval training. In my preparation for going to this college, I didn't know anything about this. Obviously, I was only 14, 15 at the time. And my idea of training was that I had a single podcast I would listen to whilst I was running, and I would simply try and finish my runs, and I had a set distance. I would simply try and finish my runs earlier and earlier into the playlist over time. And that was it. And when you look back at it intuitively, it's actually not a half bad idea, but it wasn't structured, and it certainly never exposed me to the pain of things like interval training. And we had, when it came to this cross-country team, we had pace groups, as you'd imagine, and I was doing well enough that I went up a pace group, and the jump was massive. And I so vividly remember setting off with the boys, and it was typical cross-country leg, muddy, hilly, very tough, the hardest type of training I'd done before. And the team on some of the later reps, I got dropped on the hill. We hit the hill, they carried on at the same speed, and something just snapped. I gave up. I just simply couldn't push myself, or probably more correctly, wouldn't push myself to keep up with them. And obviously had to do the walk of shame back into the finish point for the interval, was way behind them, had been completely dropped. Obviously there was no chance that I was going to catch up with them. And if anybody's ever been in this situation before, you know that it's a very different type of pain and sort of mental suffering, in terms of when you reach your physiological limit, but you've pushed yourself there. It's very different to if you have this attached feeling of failure. And I probably wasn't even remotely close to my limit, but I felt like I was. And so that added these feelings of sort of shame almost. And it was something that at the time I really, really dwelled on. I thought that, well, I'm just never going to be like these other lads. I'm never going to have the fitness to be able to keep up with them, because I've just quit. And what I now know, being more emotionally mature and looking back on it, was that I wasn't weak. I simply didn't have the skill set and the knowledge and experience to draw upon to push through. Realistically, I know now that I probably wasn't remotely working that hard. Certainly not relative to my true capacity or things that I've done since. But I didn't have the mental tools to draw upon, to look back on and say, well, I've done harder things in the past, so I can do this. When it's your first time doing these things, that's where often you have to cut yourself a little bit of slack and expect that you are not going to be perfect. So, how do we go from that inexperienced 16-year-old quitting to somebody who has now done some much harder things, and I would now consider it a strength of mine. If you have me on Strava or you've seen some of the things I've posted on Instagram, you'll know that I'm somewhat well known for being able to sit at very high relative percentages of my heart rate. My Strava profiles or heart rate profiles are rather sadistic, shall we say. And part of that is obviously just genetics of what my heart rate is, but a lot of it is learned. So how do we actually get there? Well, the simplest thing I can say is that it is progressive. And what I want everybody to take away from this is that if you bite off more than you can chew, as I've said, if you fail, you have now quit and built up a little bit of a habit of quitting. If you keep going into these sessions expecting more of yourself than is there and then are forced to quit, it becomes a habit. And what we want to do instead is drip feed you exposure to these hard efforts. So ever so slightly over time, we want to expose you to slightly harder or longer sessions. We want you to push deeper, or we want you to be able to get further through a rep, or you have to slow down, for example. And all of these things over time build up what in many circles is known as the plateau of resilience, essentially your window of tolerance. How wide a range of efforts can you push hard in? How many have you been exposed to and built up that skill where you can now say, okay, I am a person who doesn't stop. And that is only built through huge amounts of exposure over time to these little testing efforts, and all about avoiding overwhelming yourself, never ever getting to this point where you have to build this habit of quitting. That would be one of my key takeaways here. You want to break this habit of quitting, and often the only way to do that is to pull back and then build gradually. Now, when we're talking about mental toughness, this isn't very scientific, but I've broken this down into three types of toughness depending on the event, and they're really quite different. So the first is that very acute, painful effort that you feel when you are absolutely sending something like a mile, a 5K, that feeling of your heart pounding out of your chest, feeling where you just cannot get more uncomfortable if you tried. And it's often people's first exposure to mental toughness. And it's the kind of efforts, if you're not ready for, can make you hate the sport. You often hear people say, why on earth would you enjoy running or cycling? Because they've experienced this perhaps once or twice and they don't want to go through it again. Now, a number of tools that we can use to break through these sort of really painful efforts. And the most common one I use and I advise my athletes to use is chunking or segmenting. Now, when I think back about one of my last really hard efforts, so for example, 10K PB, for example, between sort of kilometers 5 and 8, I was really, really suffering. When you're pushing these paces hard, it's not a case of, oh, the sprint finish is hard. You are really suffering for the majority of the race in something like a 10K half marathon. It's very, very gritty. Like I said, between 5 and 8, I was really, really suffering. And I wasn't breaking it down into kilometer or half kilometer intervals. I was literally breaking it down into, okay, hold this pace for 200 meters more. Okay, get to the next corner. Don't slack off the pace until you round the corner. And you give yourself a bit of slack. You say, okay, you know what? If you make it to that corner at this pace, you can slow down a little bit. You get to the corner, and funnily enough, you can keep going, and you can keep doing this the whole way around. And I was actually doing a bit of mental math, so I was trying to estimate. Okay, you know what? I think I've ran about 250 meters. And I would check my watch. Okay, yeah, I've ran about 200 meters or 300 meters, whatever. And that little bit of mental maths is enough, just enough mental occupation to keep you busy, take your mind off things without being too overwhelming that you are trying to do advanced algebra in your head and take away from your ability to give hard, long efforts. But That is something that I employ every time I do a really, really hard effort. I break it down into very small chunks. I try and estimate whether I'm there, and I just give myself that little bit of breathing space then by having something else to think about, and essentially break it down really, really into short periods. The next category is your classic sort of ultra marathon, really long day out in the hills, or perhaps for some people, your marathon type effort, where particularly if it's your first one and you're not gunning for fast time, you're never really reaching that sort of acute, very, very sort of intense pain. It's fatigue, monotony, emotional management. It's all of those sort of really different feelings that you have to go through when you're pushing yourself for very long periods of time. And often it comes in waves. And it's understanding that you are in events this long, you are always going to have some kind of drop in motivation and or sort of how you're feeling, and it's knowing that you're going to experience that, being prepared for it, and ultimately understanding, okay, when this happens, I'm going to do this. If this happens, I'm going to do that, for example. And that in itself is a skill that is built through long sort of well, the type of training sessions you would do to earn your right to do these events in the first place. But it's experiencing them in race conditions. So, for example, very often you're not allowed to race with music. So, if you're training with music, you're never experiencing the monotony that comes with long, easy sessions, and you're not building up your ability to sit with your own thoughts and be present in your head for long periods of time, which for many people can be quite confronting and quite uncomfortable at first. So it's worth practicing. And it's why, or one of the reasons why we talk about training about music quite often. Very often with these events, it's important to remember, have some kind of why. You often don't have those moments of quitting in the depth of night, for example, in something like a hard effort. Whereas in a long ultramarathon or perhaps a multi-day, when you're walking or running up a steep hill, head torch on in the middle of the night, you're going to have moments where you think, why on earth am I doing this? Being prepared for that moment and saying, well, this is what it means to me. This is what the journey means to me. This is how much I've grown as a person. This is the hardest thing I've ever done. And if I can complete this, then I'll have done something I have never, ever achieved before. Having all of these sort of mantras good to go in the back of your head can be very, very helpful. And then the third sort of category is more relevant to the military, but any sort of multi-day output. So some of the really extreme ultramarathons where you might be going for 5 to 7 days, for example, or military courses where you're doing something hard and physical day in, day out for multiple weeks on or months on end. And this is something I went through myself when I went through some of the courses I've done and when I've prepared people for other courses. And I had a rule, and I tell it to everybody, and that was, you never quit in the morning. The hardest part of these courses is waking up after a hard few days, your legs are sore, your feet are battered, and you think, how on earth am I going to put on my boots? No matter what, you never ever quit in the morning. And I tell everybody that. Because yes, your legs are tired, your feet hurt, your joints hurt, whatever. You don't want to put your Bergen on again. Once you get going, once you've warmed up, it is amazing how quickly you feel good again. And it is so much easier once you get through, once you get going, all of a sudden those feelings of, God, I'm so sore, how on earth am I going to do that again? They disappear. You just kind of get on with it. And you can keep doing that day in, day out if you just don't get in your own head and you don't get to this point where you think, right, I'm done. I can't start this. I always tell all my athletes the same thing. No matter what, just start. No matter how sore you are, no matter how much you think you might not be able to complete the day's training, just start it anyway. Never, ever quit in the morning. And that was a rule I held dear and I pass on to everybody. And it's one of those things that almost helps take some of the mental pressure off. You're like, you know what? Okay, I don't think I can get through today. Okay, cool. If you want to quit, quit in the evening. And but by the time you get there, funnily enough, most people have overcome those feelings. The pressure of the day's events have passed. They've done the thing. They've had their shower, and I often tell people to think about how quickly that sort of pain and fatigue passes once you're in the shower after these events. It's very, very acutely hard in the moment, but it's going to be okay before you know it. And you never get the chance to find that out if you don't just start. So that was the single most important rule that I had and that I've given to many people. So one of those sort of mental tools is called deferred quitting. It's quite well known in sort of like the military circles. I first heard about this from a guy called Craig Weller, who's done a lot of writing on this topic, and sort of giving yourself an out that you don't ever really take. It's very, very helpful for taking some of the pressure off. So if you want a bit further reading, there you are. Go check out Craig Weller. One of the other things, and this applies to any long day, is or sort of any long endurance effort, is to expect the bad moment. And this is something that I felt I was very well prepared for, and I was very lucky that prior to going on my courses, I was told about, and they said to me that no matter what, no matter how fit you are, no matter who you are, you're going to have a bad day. You will always have a moment where you think, I cannot do this. And it is so important that you are prepared for that, because if you're taken by surprise, that is where fit people who have never been put in that situation crumble and quit. There were plenty of people fitter than me who didn't complete the course, and everybody knows very fit people who have failed military courses. And it is because they weren't mentally prepared for not being in control. And again, there's a lot of research on this. If you want to look into this further, have a look into some of the research on developing an internal locus of control. And essentially what that means is that it is so much easier to give a hard effort when we are in control, when we're the ones running the interval session, when we have chosen to do this, we know how far it's going to be, we know how long it's going to be, and we have this feeling of management over what's going on. It is far harder to maintain that composure when you don't know how far you're running, how fast. Perhaps you're not allowed your watch. Perhaps you don't know when the day's training is going to end. And developing that ability to internalize those feelings and be in control no matter what is very, very helpful. And that was the best piece of advice I was ever given. Just know that it's going to happen, and have this ability to say, okay, when it happens, I'm going to do this. And for me, it was a little negative what I had done, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend focusing on the negatives quite as much as I did. I was quite young and immature at the time, but what I did was I wrote out a list of all the crap excuses that I had heard for people for why they quit these courses, and I was determined that I was not going to add to said list. And I would look at it and say, well, I'm not going to say any of those things. And it's quite a negative frame of mind, quite cocky and arrogant, to be honest. But like I said, I'd like to think I'm a bit more emotionally mature than that now. But that worked for me. Whenever I had these bad days or bad moments, I would look at that list and I'd say, okay, this is what I was going to do. I knew if I had a bad day, I was going to get out this list and I was going to say to myself, well, if you want, you can pick up one of those rubbish excuses and you can use it yourself, but you know what that's going to do to you. You know how that's going to feel. And I was determined to not add to that list. So that was my tactic. It will be very different for everybody, but just having that actual physical plan in place of, okay, when things get tough, this is what I'm going to do, and actually physically plan that. If it's something that you can bring with you, a little reminder, perhaps a picture of why you're doing this, who you're doing this for, whatever it is, something tactile like that is so incredibly powerful, and it really shows that you know what you've done. The other thing that I found very, very helpful was I had physical copies of my training logs with me. So if at any point I thought, I can't do this, well, I could hold up my stack of books and say, you know what? You have tangible physical proof that you have earned your place here, and you can do this. I often encourage my athletes who have been very consistent and perhaps they're worried about the step up to the next event. I encourage them to scroll up through Training Peaks, for example, and look at how much green there is on their calendar. And I say to them, how can somebody who has done that many sessions that consistently and followed and done and executed on their word, how can somebody be unprepared? And that can be very helpful. It's this tangible proof that you have prepared for the event that you have signed up for, and it can be very helpful to remove some of the doubt there. So that can be very, very helpful. One of the other things that I find many people are surprised at as they get more mentally tough is the shrinking gap between what I call your floor and your ceiling. So in the beginning, and I'm going to bring it back to military testing again, just because it's a nice, easy way to understand this. Many people think that to hit a certain standard, they need the perfect day, particularly if they're not well conditioned to this. Often what we find is that as people get fitter, it's not a case of when you do the maths in terms of percentages, it's not a case of they're just fitter, so on a bad day they're still running good times. They're actually able to close the gap between their bad day and their good day. So for example, I knew that no matter what, if I was hungover, tired, I had trained the day before, whatever it was, I was capable of running a certain time that was reasonably close to my personal bests. Not because I was fitter and therefore, my bad day was a faster time, but it was actually because you have this base of experience to draw upon and say, you know what, okay, yeah, I'm tired. I've been tired before. My legs hurt. Cool, I've dealt with that before. And you can push on through those suboptimal conditions and give a higher quality result. So for context, my best ever 2K run, which was what we used in the military, was 6:11. I never quite hit the magic 6:10, which was the maximum points in this test. But 6:11, painfully close but no cigar. That was my best. I knew, however, that no matter what, I could be as tired as you want. I was probably always going to be able to run sort of sub 7 and, 650 sort of times. I did that many times on tired legs. It was because I cannot tell you how many times in training I had ran, that sub 4 minute kilometer, tired, suboptimal, not enough sleep, whatever. And so you just have all of these chances to draw upon and say, yeah, you know what, I've done this before, so I can do it again. And this is something I frequently see reported where particularly my military clients will go into a test and they'll say, I just feel so tired. And they either still PB because obviously we've made a lot of progress, or they do so much better than they expected despite initially feeling poor. Once the gun goes off, as it were, and they're off for the race, they feel so much better than they might have imagined. And we see this time and time again. It comes back to that just start. And so often, once you're in the heat of the moment, you feel so much better than you might imagine, and you're able to dig so much deeper because it's something that you've built up to. One of the final things I want to address is the myth of motivation. And I see this very, very often now, particularly in the era of things like social media challenges, where people have dreamt up these massive challenges. They think that it's all about mentality. They think about, okay, well, I really, really want this. And very often it's just a superficial want for status or the completion of something. And let's talk about sort of like the multi-day charity events, for example. We're seeing them everywhere at the moment. And the ability to get through things like that doesn't come from motivation. It comes from all of the things that we've spoken about, but primarily this slowly building up your plateau of resilience, slowly exposing yourself to harder and harder things over time, so that in the heat of the moment you can say, well, yep, I'm suffering, but I've suffered before. I'm doing hard things, or doing something hard, but I've done hard things before. No amount of motivation will get you through the midnight phase of an overnight ultra, for example, if you haven't done the work prior. So completely disregard this idea of motivation being the most important thing. Nothing will ever supersede the importance of just having over time built up your exposure to doing slightly harder things over time and building that stack of evidence that you can look upon and say, okay, that was hard. I got through it and I'm going to get through this. That is what builds mental toughness over time. It is experience. It is not one single skill that you can look on and say, yep, cool, I've listened to that podcast. I now know what that skill is. I've now heard about segmenting or chunking for the first time. I'm ready to go and do this extremely hard thing. It's not how it works. These tools are there to help you go and do these progressively harder things, to build up what you find tough, and then to slowly do more over time. So if you take nothing away from this podcast other than this, please let it be that mental toughness is a trainable quality. It is not a fixed personality trait, and it is not something that is unlocked overnight. You will not now suddenly be super mentally tough because you've listened to this podcast. You will now have the tools to go out and stack some of that experience. So use some of those tools that we've spoken about, the segmenting, the planning for a bad day, to go and do hard things. And over time, you will increase your capacity to do even harder things. So there we have it. Mental toughness, a trainable quality, not a personality trait. If you have listened to this and perhaps I'm going to sort of go back on something I've said here and use the horrendous word of motivated. But if you have listened to this and you're now inspired and motivated to take on something big, well, we do have slots open for our gold one-to-one coaching service. And if you want to get involved and learn more about this, book in a free chat with myself or JB and talk about how we can help you, then the link to do so is in the description of this podcast, wherever you are listening to it. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to have you back in the next one.